At 4:22 in the afternoon, a concrete lid weighing 160 tons is thrown 25 meters through the air. The explosion is heard 15 kilometers away, in the town of Kyshtym. Within hours, a radioactive plume, carrying the force of 80 tons of TNT, begins drifting northeast across the southern Urals. But here is the thing that makes this story different from every other nuclear disaster you have ever heard. The Soviet Union buried it for 32 years. And when a scientist finally told the West what had happened, the British nuclear establishment called him a fantasist, said it was physically impossible. They were wrong, and the CIA had known the truth since 1959. This is Kyshtym, 1957. The nuclear catastrophe that two governments decided you did not need to know about. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what Mayak was built to do, and the speed at which it was forced to do it. In 1948, Joseph Stalin ordered a plutonium production facility to be constructed in the eastern Urals, in a location so remote it did not appear on Soviet maps. The facility was assigned the designation Chelyabinsk 40. The town that grew around it, Ozyorsk, did not officially exist. The mission was singular: match the Americans, produce plutonium for Soviet nuclear weapons before the United States consolidated its monopoly. The scientists and engineers who built Mayak worked under conditions that would not be permitted anywhere else in the world. Early waste from the reactors was dumped directly into the Tecker River from 1949 to 1951. When that became impossible to conceal, waste was redirected into storage tanks and into Lake Karachay, a lake that would later be described by some researchers as the most radiologically contaminated body of water on the surface of the Earth. But in 1957, the immediate problem was the tanks. Each high-level waste storage tank at Mayak was designed with a water cooling jacket. Radioactive decay generates heat continuously, without cooling. A tank of concentrated waste will heat itself. The cooling system for tank number 14 of storage unit C3 developed a coolant leak sometime in late 1956. The failure was logged in maintenance records. Management was informed. The repair was deferred. Working in that radiation environment was complex, expensive, and the facility was under production pressure. So tank number 14 was left, its cooling water slowly draining away, its contents slowly heating, slowly evaporating, until what remained at the bottom was not liquid at all. It was dry salt, ammonium nitrate compounds, sodium acetate, iron nitrate fission products dissolved through the matrix. The same chemistry as an industrial explosive, concentrated by months of uncontrolled heat. By September 1957, the temperature inside tank number 14 had reached an estimated 330 degrees Celsius. And here is where the situation changed completely. It is Sunday, September 29, 1957. The afternoon shift at Mayak is running. The facility is processing plutonium. The tanks are unmonitored. There are no real-time temperature sensors on the waste storage units. No alarms, no redundancy. At 4:22 p.m., tank number 14 detonates. The explosion is not nuclear. That distinction will matter to the Soviet government later when they look for language to minimize what happened. But the chemical detonation, 80 tons of TNT equivalent, blows the 160-ton reinforced concrete lid completely off the tank and launches it across the facility yard. The radioactive material inside, representing 20,000,000 curies of activity, is thrown into the atmosphere. To put that number in context, the contamination released at Kyshtym that afternoon is estimated at roughly 1/3 of the total radioactivity released at Chernobyl nearly 30 years later, from a disaster that the world was never told about. Within minutes, the plume has risen to 500 meters. The prevailing wind is from the south. The contamination moves northeast across fields, forests, rivers, and villages, none of whose residents have any idea what is passing over them. At 4:22 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon, the East Ural radioactive trace begins forming. It will eventually stretch 350 kilometers. It will cover 23,000 square kilometers. Approximately 270,000 people live within its path. None of them are told anything. What nobody knew yet, what the people of the surrounding villages could not have known, was that the Soviet government had already decided this would never be reported. The KGB classification order reached regional authorities within days. The word that would be used internally was the same word they used for everything they needed to erase: state secret. 1 week after the explosion, 7 days in which the village of Berdiansk, 6 kilometers from the blast site, had received no warning and no information, Soviet soldiers arrived and told the residents they had 1 hour to leave. Zhores Medvedev was a young woman living in Berdiansk at the time. Decades later, she described what happened. Soldiers came and said we had to go. They gave us an hour. We could take almost nothing, just what we could carry. Nobody told us what had happened or why. My mother cried when she saw her house for the last time. We never went back. Over the following weeks, 10,000 to 11,000 people were evacuated from 23 villages. No explanations were given. Contaminated homes were not decontaminated. They were demolished. The land was plowed under. Villages that had existed for generations were erased from the map, as efficiently as they had been erased from the official record. Local doctors in Chelyabinsk Oblast received explicit instructions from Moscow. Radiation-related diagnoses were not to be recorded. One former nurse, Valentina Kuznetsova, described it years later. We were told these patients had special disease. That was the code. We all knew what it meant, but no one could write it down. The Soviets established a secret research institute, the Ural Scientific Center for Radiation Medicine, specifically to study the health effects of the contamination. The findings were classified. What those classified studies showed, and what Western researchers eventually confirmed after Soviet records became partially available in the 1990s, was elevated rates of leukemia, thyroid cancer, and chronic radiation syndrome across the exposed population. The precise number of lives claimed by Kyshtym remains contested. Soviet records were deliberately destroyed or falsified, and the affected population was scattered across a contaminated corridor the length of a small country. In 1966, the Soviet government established the East Ural State Reserve, a vast nature preserve in the Uit corridor. The official reason given was ecological research. The actual reason was that the land was too contaminated for human habitation. The reserve exists to this day. For 19 years, Kyshtym did not exist in the public record of any country. Then, in November 1976, a Soviet molecular biologist named Zhores Medvedev published an article in the British journal New Scientist. He had been living in exile in London. He could not cite classified documents. He had none. Instead, he had done something more methodical. He had traced the absence. Medvedev noticed that Soviet ecological literature on the southern Urals had simply stopped after 1957. Papers on the Ural River system, on the region's wildlife, on its water quality, gone from journals, as if the entire ecosystem had ceased to be of scientific interest overnight. He noticed a nature reserve of unusual size had appeared in an area with no prior ecological significance. He noticed the sudden expansion of the Ural Scientific Center for Radiation Medicine. He published his conclusions, and the British nuclear establishment dismissed him immediately. Lord Walter Marshall, chief scientist at the UK Atomic Energy Authority, declared Medvedev's account science fiction, said such an accident was physically impossible. What the National Security Archive at George Washington University later established, through declassified CIA documents, was that the United States government had known about the Kyshtym disaster since 1959. A CIA report from June of that year stated, in formal intelligence language, that sources in the Chelyabinsk region indicated a serious accident at a Soviet nuclear facility in autumn 1957, with widespread population displacement consistent with radiation exposure. The CIA knew and said nothing publicly. The British nuclear establishment dismissed the truth when a scientist told it plainly, because in 1976, acknowledging that a major nuclear accident had occurred anywhere would have complicated the public argument for the expansion of nuclear power in the West. The Soviet Union did not officially acknowledge Kyshtym until 1989, 32 years after the explosion, when Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost reforms made concealment no longer tenable. The Kyshtym disaster eventually forced two specific changes into international nuclear law, changes that arrived decades late, at enormous cost. The first was the IAEA Radioactive Waste Safety Standards Program, the RADWAS framework, which established mandatory requirements for cooling system redundancy and real-time temperature monitoring in high-level waste storage tanks. The failure mode at tank number 14, a known defect, unrepaired, unmonitored, was precisely what this framework was designed to prevent. It was codified into international guidance only after the disaster became publicly known. The second was Russia's own federal law on radiation safety, enacted in 1996, which established mandatory public disclosure requirements for radiation incidents and created the legal framework for protecting affected populations, rights that the 270,000 people in the East Ural radioactive trace never had. Mayak continues to operate today. The facility still processes nuclear waste from Russian reactors. Lake Karachay, the waste lake on the same site, has been partially filled with concrete and rock, a decades-long effort to stabilize it. The East Ural State Reserve remains closed to the public. The cooling system on tank number 14 failed in 1956. The repair order was raised. The repair was deferred. That decision made by someone, somewhere in the facility management chain, in a meeting that was never recorded or acknowledged, contaminated an area the size of the state of Vermont, displaced more than 10,000 people from their homes without explanation, and was successfully hidden from the world for 32 years. Not because the science was difficult, because the silence was convenient. If this story stays with you, and the question of what governments choose not to tell their citizens, the Goiânia Cesium-137 accident of 1987 follows a similar pattern. A radioactive source, ignored warnings, and a city that nearly became uninhabitable. That episode is on the channel now.